So it's about time for us to begin. If you want to come in, have a seat. We're so thankful that you've made it in this morning. Thankful for the treats that we got to have. And if you're still eating your cinnamon roll, that's fine. When Eddie hits the 2-minute mark, I'm going to come finish off everyone's cinnamon roll. So if you don't have it done by then, I'll finish it off. No, we're so thankful for Cindy Coleman and Madeline DeLong, and Michaela for getting the cinnamon rolls ready for us. They were very delicious, and I know they have it's a tradition that starts around midnight, and they have been up and at 'em. And I asked Madeline how she's doing. She says she's a little loopy, and I understand that. But we're so thankful, still is. So thankful for them for the cinnamon rolls this morning, the hospitality, and we as the University Church are thrilled to get to supply that to those who are visiting with us for Focal Point. Today, again, we have Eddie Parrish, who is going to be starting us off with the Psalms of Ascent. We're looking forward to what he has to bring to us. I believe we're on Psalm 123 today. Is that right?
122.
122. I got ahead of myself. 122. Psalm 122.
One of the goals in sermon preparation is to bridge gaps. And specifically, I have in mind the gaps that exist between the biblical world and our world. And there are several of them. You have language gaps. There are cultural gaps. There's obviously the time gap. You have religious gaps, especially when you're talking about Old Testament times to today. We need to bridge those gaps, and if we can't do that, then the Bible will remain, for most people, a paradox, and the God of the Bible distant and aloof. And so we need to bridge those gaps. And one of the differences between the ancient religion of the Jews and Christianity is that we make no obligatory pilgrimage journeys like they did. We've been setting the stage for these Psalms of Ascent by pointing out the fact that these were songs that the Jewish people sang as they traveled 3 times a year to Jerusalem for the feast days that required that travel: Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Well, we don't have that. We don't do that in the church. We don't have those obligatory pilgrimage journeys. The closest things that I can think of that might parallel those kinds of things, and these are not obligatory, but they parallel them in some ways, are some of our annual gatherings like Focal Point, maybe polishing the pulpit, or maybe church camps. I'll be going to Camp Bandina in about a month for our regular session there. And I get excited for camp because it's a special event. And I get to see people and renew friendships with people that I don't see except for that particular week of the year. And when I think about camp, there's no feeling to me like crossing the Medina River and driving up the hill onto camp property. And maybe you have something similar to that with a camp or with something like Focal Point. When Focal Point draws closer, don't you get excited? And for 2 reasons. Cinnamon rolls. But those are the closest things that I can think of that comes maybe somewhat close to paralleling those pilgrimage journeys that the Jewish people made each year. Outside of those special events for us, outside of those kinds of special events, we assemble weekly and we assemble locally. We get together with the same people. And the frequency of those assemblies can Not that they should, but they can dampen the anticipation of the gathering. The more we do it, the more frequently we do it with the same people, it can become very routine, and we lose over time that anticipation, that excitement. We have to work harder to keep that from happening. And so with that in mind, let's explore Psalm 122 and focus on the joy that it expresses about the worship experience. And we'll divide the psalm into two sections. Number one, we'll call this the present experience. The present experience, verses 1 through 5. I was glad when they said to me, "Let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet are standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem, built as a city that is bound firmly together, to which the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, as was decreed for Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord. Their thrones for judgment were set, the thrones of the house of David." Now let's set the context for this psalm. And if you're preaching these Psalms of Ascent, I encourage you to do that with each of the lessons. Make sure folks understand the progression of thought that connects these Psalms together. Psalm 120, the despair of living among people who hate peace. That was the setting of that first psalm. The psalmist is talking about his experience, his present experience where he was, far away from Jerusalem, from Meshech to Kedar. And he's anticipating being able to go back to Jerusalem and be with his people for this period of worship and celebration. Psalm 121, the journey begins. He's among the heathen, and he lifts up his eyes to the hills. He sees the rugged terrain before him, but he's about to set out on that journey. And in that psalm, he expresses the confidence, the faith that he has that God is going to bring them safely through their journey. And now, that despair of living among hostile people, 120, and the confidence that God would grant safe passage, 121, now those things give way to the joy of arrival. And he looks back now that he's there, now that his feet, verse 2, are standing within the gates of Jerusalem. He thinks back and says, I was glad. I rejoiced. I celebrated when I was told, let us go to the house of the Lord. When the announcement was made, it's time to go to Jerusalem for the feast. Let's go. He said, when I heard those words, I was excited. I celebrated. And now we're here. Our feet are standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. That treacherous journey of Psalm 121 had been worth the effort. And the combination of both relief and excitement echo in that sentiment of verse 2. We're standing within your gates. It's as if the psalmist is saying, I can't believe I'm finally here. It's happened again. What I've been anticipating, the journey out from among those that I share very little in common with, to come to this place where I can be with my people and worship God. I can't believe I'm finally here. We're not going to get to Psalm 126, but in that psalm, they'll talk about being restored to Jerusalem, and he'll say in that psalm, it was like a dream come true. Have we lost that? Have we lost that in our gatherings? He looks around now that he's within the gates of the city of God, and he describes it. Think about this. They've journeyed all this way. Now they have entered the gates of the city, and now the city is before them. And he's looking around at the city, and he's contemplating the meaning of what Jerusalem is and what it stands for and its place in God's plan. And he describes the city in verse 3, Jerusalem, built as a city bound firmly together, that's ESV, compact together, New American Standard, New King James. Another translation, solidly joined together. What's he talking about there with regard to the city? Well, two ideas have been offered, basically. Some say that he's referring to the physical dimensions of the city, that once you got inside the city gates, everything was so compact together that it made togetherness inevitable, physically speaking. Had all these people coming from all over for these feasts. The population in Jerusalem would grow exponentially at those times as people would come into the city, and everything being so physically compact together, you were going to be together whether you wanted to be or not. The physical dimensions. Others have said that maybe it's something deeper than that perhaps it's a statement of the unity of the inhabitants of the city. That the city is used kind of, like a metonymy kind of thing, that the city is mentioned, but the inhabitants of the city are intended, and that the inhabitants of the city are knit together closely. They've come together united in purpose. Well, which is it? Well, I'll venture this. I think it's probably more the first that contributes to the second. That the physical compactness of the city is probably what's intended, but because of that, it kind of forces a unity together, and it contributes to the feeling of singularity of purpose. Because everybody recognizes that all these people that are compact in this city, we're all here for the same reason. To worship, to celebrate, to focus on God. And so the psalmist is contemplating the city as he's walked within its gates, and he's looking at it, and he says, this is that compact place where we've come, bound firmly together. Verse 4, to which the tribes go up. The tribes of the Lord, as was decreed for Israel. Now he's stating the purpose. We're here because God decreed that we be here. This is the place. This is where the tribes go. We all come back to Jerusalem for these feast days. And so in those first few verses, he's getting his bearings in the city. And they offer thanksgiving to God for the city and the role that it plays. Verse 5 references that role too, where he says, with regard to Jerusalem there, thrones for judgment were set. The thrones of the house of David. Jerusalem was to have a role as a center for justice. That was what was supposed to come from the palace, from the throne, from the kings. Justice. Jerusalem was to be a light of justice and truth to the world. Jerusalem played that vital role in their history. And so when a faithful, conscientious Jewish person walked through the gates of the city, this would be their sentiment. I can't believe we're finally here. Jerusalem, the center for justice and truth. This compact city that forces us to come in and be together. And we're here because God has decreed that we be here. And we're here to offer Him our thanksgiving and our praise. And so these verses paint a picture of the worshiper overcome with excitement because he's arrived at the city of God with all his kinsmen to join them in the joyful worship of God. The present experience. Now, verses 6 through 9, the future experience. The future experience. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they be secure who love you. Peace be within your walls and security within your towers. For my brothers and companions' sake, I will say, peace be within you. For the sake of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek your good. So as this worshiper is exulting in that present experience of having finally arrived for the great feast and celebration, as he thinks about all of that, he can't bear the thought of it not always being that way. His mind wanders to others that he identifies in verse 8 as my family, my brothers, my friends, my companions. He thinks about them, and He wants for them to share the joy that He was currently experiencing. And it's that led Him then to pray Himself and to call upon others to pray for peace in Jerusalem. And so you see that in verse 6, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. You see it in verse 7. Here's the specific prayer. Peace be within your walls. You see it in verse 8. For my brothers and companions' sake, I'll say, peace be within you. He prays for prosperity, verse 6, to rest on those who love the city of God, and for those who occupy its palaces, verse number 7. And so as He's assembled with the rest of these people for worship and celebration, He thinks about others and He says essentially to Himself, I want it to always be this way. And so pray, He says to His companions and to Himself, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. You see, worship is easier and so much better when we're able to offer it in an environment of peace. And He knew that. Jerusalem did not always experience peace in its history, and He knew that. And so when He could arrive at a time of peace to Jerusalem and have all of these people together without any kind of a cloud of war or unrest over them, where they could just simply gather together and assemble and worship together in peace, that meant something to Him, and meant so much to Him that he prayed and called upon others to pray that it would always be that way. For the sake of His family and friends, verse 8, for the sake of the house of God, verse 9, He promises that He will only seek good things for Jerusalem. And the reason? Because He wants others, including generations who come after Him, to be able to experience the excitement and the joy that He experienced in coming to Jerusalem for worship. Isn't that a beautiful psalm? Now let's spend our remaining minutes on some application thoughts. If we have lost it, then we need to work and work hard to recapture the joy of worship and the joy of Christian fellowship. We ought not let the frequency of our gatherings lead us to view them as commonplace. When we come together from different backgrounds, different races, different economic levels, we should be, as verse 3 described Jerusalem, bound firmly together. And that's possible when our rallying cry has nothing to do with background, race, or economics. When our rallying cry is Jesus, we can be compact together. Wasn't it Jesus who brought together in His small band of apostles a turncoat liberal tax collector, Matthew, on the one hand, and a right-wing extremist zealot, Simon, on the other? Yes, He did. The answer to that is yes, He did. Matthew 10, verses 3 and 4 identifies them. Matthew, tax collector. Simon, zealot. In that band of 12. Who brought them together? Jesus did. Now, I'm going to let you in on just a little fantasy that I have. I can't prove this, but I really do love to think that it's true. Do you remember in Mark 6, verse 7, where Mark tells us that Jesus sent His apostles out 2 by 2? How do you think He paired them up? I don't know, but I like to think that Jesus looked at Matthew and Simon and says, okay, you two go together. Jesus could do that. Jesus can do that. Unity among His disciples was important to Jesus. John 17, 20 and 21. He prayed for us. He prayed for His apostles, but He said, not just for them, but I pray for all of those who would believe in me through their word. Who does that include? Exactly. Jesus prayed for us that night. What did He pray? Unity. That they would all be one. We need to consider, brothers and sisters of mine, the future of the church and pray for the peace and unity of it. We're making application here. We're not confined to Jerusalem. The context of the psalm was the city of Jerusalem and what went on there. Jesus, of course, remember said that there was coming a time where neither in Jerusalem nor in this mountain would you worship, John chapter 4. In other words, location was not going to be important at some point. We're in that time. So we're making application to the church here. And so we need to pray for the unity of the church, and not just pray for it, work for it. If we're not careful, and this passage has been mentioned in previous lessons this week, if we're not careful, we will bite and devour each other over insignificant matters. I understand there are times when division is necessary. Jesus said so. Matthew 10, there's a time for a sword to be brought. Paul even said in 1 Corinthians 11, verse 19, there must be factions among you. And the reason is so that those who are approved will be evident. As terrible as division is, one of the things positively that it can do is it can show us who God's people really are. So there are times when division has to happen, but I'm measuring my words. We don't seek it out. Not if we're God's people. We seek peace and pursue it. 1 Peter 3:11. As much as depends on us, we live peaceably with all men. Romans 12:18. We certainly don't make division the focal point of our Christianity. We're to pursue the things that make for peace. Romans 14:19. We're to be diligent to preserve the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Ephesians 4:3. We're to live in peace with one another. 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 13. I fear that some among us might be making division their identity. That's who they are. The ones that are seeking to highlight differences instead of seeking to find peace. Folks, our nation is divided. Let's not talk about the church for now. Think about our nation. Our nation's divided. And I'm afraid hopelessly so. I hope I'm wrong about that. I really do. But I don't see any evidence that things are going to get any better in our nation as far as division is concerned. Over my dead body, will we let that divisive, cynical, suspicious attitude take over the church that wears the name of the Prince of Peace? Amen. When Paul wrote about people who were drawing lines of fellowship where God had not, he said, we would not yield in submission to them for one moment. Galatians 2:5. And he told us why. So that the truth of the gospel might be preserved. You start drawing lines where God hasn't, you're no longer standing for truth. You're hindering it and disrupting the very fellowship Jesus died to create. Pray for the peace of the church. Now back to Psalm 122. When I read Psalm 122, especially those first verses, I come away thinking, I want to be that guy. I want to be excited at the anticipation of worship. I want to attend worship and stand in this place with all of you and think, I can't believe I'm actually here. I want to see a church knit together in unifying love, offering praise and thanksgiving with one voice to God. And I want that for my sons, and I want it for your sons and your daughters and your grandchildren. And may God grant prosperity and long life to those who love the church and seek the good of it. And may there be such a prevailing spirit of unity and brotherhood that we can assemble without suspicion and without cynicism toward each other, but with joy inexpressible and full of glory. And may God help me to be one who promotes that. Thank you much.